The story began on what should have been an ordinary morning. The sun was rising, the air was calm, and everything about the neighborhood seemed perfectly normal. But waiting in the mailbox that day was a single envelope that would ignite a war, lasting months, a battle that would pit one homeowner against the very people who were supposed to protect the community. The envelope was stamped with the official letterhead of the Homeowners Association. At first glance, it looked routine, maybe just another update about community events or a reminder about trash collection. But inside was a letter that would change everything. It was a fine, not just any fine, but a demand for payment because, according to the HOA, the homeowner's yard had violated aesthetic standards. The letter claimed that the grass was too green, standing out against other lawns in the neighborhood. The irony was almost laughable. The yard was immaculate, perfectly trimmed, healthy, and exactly the kind of lawn anyone would be proud of. The letter listed a penalty of several $100s. And worse, it threatened that if the payment was not made within 30 days, the fines would increase, and eventually a lien could be placed on the property. The tone of the letter was smug, cold, and deliberately intimidating. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. The homeowner stood there staring at the words in disbelief. A yard that was too green? The absurdity of it didn't matter. The HOA had the power to enforce rules, and they clearly intended to use it. It didn't take long to realize what this was really about. The HOA board, led by a small group of self-important residents, had been itching to exert control. They thrived on rules, regulations, and nitpicking every detail of people's lives, and this time, their target was a homeowner who had never caused trouble, someone who had simply kept their yard in better condition than anyone else on the street. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about the ridiculous fine, some amused, others quietly nervous. After all, if the HOA could invent violations this absurd, then no one was safe. But the homeowner wasn't the type to simply pay up and move on. No, this fine wasn't going to disappear quietly. It was going to spark something much bigger. At first, there was an attempt to reason with the board. Letters were written, photos of the yard were submitted, and logic was applied. But logic had no place here. The board doubled down, insisting. The yard disrupted community harmony and created an unfair comparison for other homeowners. The fines increased with every passing week. The more the homeowner resisted, the more aggressive the HOA became. Warning letters piled up. Threats escalated. They seemed confident that their target would eventually fold, write a check, and move on. But that wasn't going to happen. Instead of caving, the homeowner began to watch, to take notes, to look closer at the very people who were issuing the fines. And what they found was hypocrisy in its purest form. The HOA president's own yard was a disaster. Patchy grass, weeds sprouting at the edges, and even a broken fence post leaning into the street. Another board member hadn't repainted their shutters in over a decade, though the rules demanded fresh paint every 5 years. And then there were the unapproved decorations scattered around the properties of nearly every board member. The HOA was quick to punish others, but refused to follow their own rules. That was when the idea first took root. If the HOA wanted to play this game, then it was time to play it better than they ever could. The homeowners started small. They collected evidence, photographs, timestamps, documented violations. Every crack in a driveway, every weed, every chipped paint surface. A folder grew thicker by the day, filled with undeniable proof that the board members were the worst offenders of the very rules they enforced. But the plan wasn't just about evidence, it was about patience. Because revenge is sweetest when it's slow, methodical, and absolutely devastating. The HOA thought they had power. They thought they could bully one homeowner into submission. What they didn't know was that they had just created their worst nightmare. And the first step of the plan was already in motion. The days passed, and the fines kept coming, but the homeowner didn't flinch. Every letter, every threat only fueled the determination to strike back harder. And while the HOA celebrated their small victories, they had no idea the storm that was about to hit them. Because this wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about exposing the hypocrisy, tearing down the board's false authority, and showing the entire neighborhood just how corrupt their so-called leaders truly were. The first letter was just the spark. The fire had only begun, and when the flame spread, no one on that HOA board would escape untouched. The first letter had been absurd, but the growing stack of warnings that followed turned it into something far darker. What had begun as a ridiculous complaint about a lawn being too green was now escalating into threats of liens, property, seizures, and legal action. Most people would have panicked, paid the fines, and tried to stay off the radar of the HOA board. But instead, the homeowner decided to fight fire with fire. The decision wasn't made in anger alone. It was born from observation. The board members strutted around the neighborhood like little monarchs, handing out citations as if they were confetti, yet their own homes were far from perfect. That hypocrisy was the crack in their armor. And if one was willing to dig deep, enough, the entire facade could crumble. So the homeowner began collecting evidence. It started with something as simple as a walk around the block, camera in hand, snapping photos of every minor violation that caught the eye. Overgrown shrubs, blocking the sidewalk, trash bins left out for days past pickup, faded paint peeling from shutters, broken mailboxes tilted at odd angles. Small details, yes, but each one was technically a violation under the same strict rules the HOA had weaponized. But the deeper the investigation went, the worse it became. The HOA president, the same person who had signed the letter demanding fines for a too green lawn, had grass so patchy it looked more like dirt than anything else. Their gutters sagged with debris. Their fence leaned dangerously toward collapse, a clear hazard. Yet no violation notices ever seemed to find their way to that address. The vice president's home wasn't any better. A rusted swing set sat abandoned in the backyard, visible from the street, violating community rules about unsightly structures. Their driveway was stained with oil leaks, another forbidden blemish. And then there were the decorations. Seasonal. Lights still hanging in the middle of summer, yard ornaments that clearly broke the rules about aesthetic harmony. Every discovery was carefully documented. Photos were labeled with dates and times. Videos were recorded to show that these weren't temporary slip-ups, but long-standing issues ignored for months. A spreadsheet began to grow, listing each board, member, their address, and the violations found on their property. The hypocrisy was staggering, and the evidence was overwhelming. But evidence alone wasn't enough. The HOA had power because it controlled perception. It ruled the neighborhood through intimidation by convincing homeowners that compliance was the only option. To truly strike back, the plan had to expose that hypocrisy not just to the board itself, but to every single resident in the community. The homeowner began talking quietly with neighbors. Some were cautious, afraid of retaliation. Others were eager to share their own stories, tales of petty fines, selective enforcement, and endless harassment. One family had been fined for leaving a garden hose coiled on the side of their home, while another had been threatened for hanging a bird feeder. Meanwhile, board members lived without consequence, flaunting the very rules they enforced. As the stories piled up, so did the resolve. This wasn't just about one homeowner's yard anymore. It was about an entire community that had been bullied into submission by people who believed themselves untouchable. Late nights were spent assembling everything into a detailed dossier. Photos, videos, spreadsheets, and written accounts. It was meticulous, organized, and undeniable. And while the HOA continued to send threatening letters, the homeowner wasn't just waiting idly by. They were building a weapon. But the plan wasn't to go directly to the board. That would only give them a chance to bury the evidence or twist the narrative. No, the strike had to be public, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. The goal wasn't just to embarrass the HOA, but to dismantle its power completely. The first test came one weekend when the homeowner printed anonymous flyers. Each flyer displayed photos of the HOA president's yard, side by side with the violation codes from the association's own rulebook. They were left discreetly on community bulletin boards, slipped into mailboxes, and even taped to the clubhouse door. It didn't take long before neighbors were whispering. Some laughed, others grew angry, but all of them began to see the truth. The mighty enforcers of the HOA weren't living by their own rules. The board was furious. Emergency meetings were called. Accusations flew. But the homeowner stayed silent, watching from the shadows as paranoia spread. Every board member suspected the other of leaking the information. Trust within their circle began to fracture, and this was only the beginning. The flyers were just a taste of what was to come. Because while the HOA scrambled to control the rumors, the homeowner was preparing the next phase. A full, undeniable exposure of every violation, every abuse of power, every act of hypocrisy presented in front of the entire neighborhood. The trap had been set. The evidence had been collected. And while the board believed they still had control, their downfall was already written. But patience was key. One wrong move, one premature reveal, and the board might find a way to spin the story. The timing had to be perfect. The exposure had to be devastating. The homeowner knew the HOA wanted to play a game of control. What they didn't realize was that they were no longer the ones pulling the strings, and soon the entire neighborhood would see the truth. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a breaking point. Flyers had already rattled the board, but those were just whispers. Rumors floating from mailbox to mailbox, conversations exchanged in hushed tones at backyard fences. What was about to happen next would be far louder, far more public, and far more humiliating. The homeowner had spent weeks preparing the first real strike. The evidence was there, stacked high in folders and neatly organized on a computer. But evidence alone wasn't enough. It had to be presented in a way that stripped the board of their credibility, shattered their image of authority, and forced the entire community to question why they were being ruled by people who couldn't even follow their own rules. The opportunity came in the form of the quarterly HOA meeting. Attendance was usually sparse. A handful of residents showed up, while the rest either ignored the process or feared retaliation if they spoke out. But this time, the homeowner made sure things would be different. In the week leading up to the meeting, anonymous invitations circulated, slipped under doors, pinned to bulletin boards, even sent in unmarked envelopes. Each invitation carried a simple message. See the truth about your HOA. Meeting this Thursday. No details, no names, just enough to spark curiosity. When Thursday arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Residents who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, filling every seat and even spilling out into the hallway. The board members sat at the front, clearly uneasy, whispering among themselves as they tried to figure out why the turnout was so unusually high. The meeting began like all the others, with the president droning on about budgets, landscaping, updates, and vague promises of protecting property values. But just as they were about to move on to new business, the homeowner stood up. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just a calm announcement. Evidence had been gathered. Evidence that showed the board had been selectively enforcing rules, targeting certain homeowners while ignoring their own violations. Then came the reveal. Photo after photo, projected on a screen for everyone to see. The president's crumbling fence, the vice president's rust-stained driveway, the treasurer's illegal backyard shed. Each image was paired with the exact rule from the HOA handbook that it violated. Murmurs spread through the room, growing louder with each slide. Gasps, laughter, even jeers. Neighbors who had been fined for the smallest infractions now saw the board exposed as hypocrites. For the first time, the fear that had hung over the community began to dissolve. The board tried to fight back, insisting the photos were outdated, misinterpreted, or irrelevant. But the evidence was airtight. Every picture time-stamped, every violation carefully documented. And when a few brave residents began sharing their own stories of unfair fines and harassment, the tide turned completely. By the end of the night, the board was on the defensive. Their carefully constructed image of authority had been shattered in front of the very people they claimed to represent. The meeting ended in chaos, with residents demanding answers, calling for resignations, and openly mocking the very people who had once intimidated them. For the homeowner, it was only the beginning. This was the first strike, the opening blow, in a campaign that would not end until the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was broken. But victory wasn't guaranteed yet. The board still had power, and they were furious. In the days that followed, the retaliation came quickly. More violation letters arrived, each one harsher than the last. Threats of legal action escalated. The board accused the homeowner of slander, harassment, and even trespassing for taking photos of their properties. They tried to paint themselves as victims, twisting the story to win sympathy. But the damage had already been done. The community had seen too much to go back. Neighbors who once stayed silent now spoke openly about their own frustrations. Conversations buzzed on sidewalks, at mailboxes, and over backyard fences. A quiet rebellion was brewing. The homeowner stayed calm. Every new letter from the board was carefully filed away. Every threat was documented. If the board wanted to make this personal, then it would only give the homeowner more ammunition. Meanwhile, the plan moved to its next phase. Flyers were one thing. A public meeting was another. But what would truly dismantle the HOA's power was complete transparency. the homeowner began building a website, a digital archive of every violation, every photo, every piece of hypocrisy. It would be accessible to every resident, updated regularly, and impossible for the board to suppress. And while the board scrambled to regain control, the homeowner was already one step ahead, preparing to unleash the next wave of exposure. The board thought they were facing one frustrated homeowner. What they didn't realize was that they were now fighting against their entire community. Neighbors united by shared frustration, fueled by anger, and led by someone who refused to back down. The first strike had landed. The board was reeling. But the war was far from over, because once the website went live, there would be no going back. The HOA board had survived scandals before, but nothing like this. The public shaming at the last meeting had left them fractured, exposed, and scrambling for control. They sent more fines, issued more threats, and whispered about legal action, but their grip on the neighborhood was slipping. People weren't afraid anymore, and fear had been the one thing keeping the board in power. The turning point came the day the website went live. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. The homepage was simple. Know the rules, see the truth. Below it was a gallery of photos, every violation committed by the board, neatly organized by property address and cross-referenced with the HOA's own handbook. Clicking each image opened detailed explanations, timestamps, and even side-by-side. Comparisons with citations ordinary homeowners had received for far less. The effect was immediate. Within hours, the site spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Residents forwarded it to one another, screens lit up at dinner tables, and even kids showed their parents the photos. Suddenly, the hypocrisy wasn't a rumor or a whisper. It was undeniable, permanent, and accessible to everyone. The board panicked. They called emergency meetings, sent out official letters demanding the site be taken down, and accused the homeowner of defamation. But the more they protested, the worse it looked, because the evidence wasn't fake. It was their yards, their fences, their trash bins, captured in crystal clarity for everyone to see. Neighbors who had been fined hundreds of dollars for the smallest infractions were furious. One woman who had been cited for leaving her trash bin out overnight now saw photos of the treasurer's overflowing bins left in plain sight for days. Another resident who had been fined for a faded shutter looked at the vice president's house and realized those shutters hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. The outrage built like a wave. It wasn't just anger at the hypocrisy, it was anger at years of bullying, intimidation, and control. And once that anger found a voice, it spread. The homeowner watched quietly as the rebellion grew. Residents began to organize, group chats popped up. Anonymous flyers circulated again, this time made by others. Someone even printed large posters of the board's violations and pinned them to telephone poles. It was no longer one person fighting back, it was the entire neighborhood. The board tried to regain control, but every move backfired. They issued new violation letters, only to find them taped up on community bulletin boards for everyone to laugh at. They threatened lawsuits, but residents countered by pooling money for legal defense. They tried to host their own emergency meeting, but almost no one showed up. Instead, the clubhouse parking lot filled with homeowners holding their own gathering, demanding the board's resignation. The pressure mounted day by day. News of the revolt spread to nearby neighborhoods, and whispers began circulating about local reporters catching wind of the story. The board members, once smug and untouchable, now avoided eye contact when walking their dogs or checking their mail. Their authority was collapsing in real time, but the homeowner knew this was the most dangerous phase of the battle. Cornered. Opponent fights hardest, and the board still had one last weapon: bureaucracy. They tried to change rules overnight, rewriting bylaws to protect themselves. They attempted to delete past violation records, pretending they had never issued fines unfairly. They even went so far as to file police reports against the homeowner, accusing them of harassment for stalking their properties. None of it worked. The police dismissed the complaints. The bylaw changes were challenged by residents who now attended every meeting in force. And the website continued to grow, updated with every desperate move the board made. The more they fought back, the guiltier they looked. By now, the community wasn't just angry, they were organized. Petitions circulated demanding the board step down. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now stood proudly at the forefront, speaking out about years of abuse. Driveways became gathering points for late-night discussions. Yards displayed subtle signs of solidarity. porch lights left on at the same hour, identical garden flags popping up across the neighborhood. It was a quiet, unified rebellion, visible in 1,000 small ways. And at the center of it all, the homeowner remained patient. They had started this fight alone, but now they no longer had to act as the sole weapon. The community itself had become the storm. Still, patience had its limits. The board wasn't stepping down voluntarily. They clung to power even as it slipped through their fingers. And so, the homeowner prepared the next move. Not another flyer, not another website. Update, but something final. Something that would leave the board no room to maneuver, no excuse to hide, and no chance of recovery. The plan was simple. Take the evidence beyond the neighborhood. Share it with local media, expose the corruption on a scale too large for the board to suppress. Let the world see how far a small group of power-hungry neighbors would go to control a community, and how quickly that control could be dismantled when people united against them. The public uprising had begun in whispers, grown into shouts, and now it was ready to roar. The HOA board had become a laughingstock, a symbol of everything wrong, with petty power. And soon, they wouldn't just lose their neighborhood. They'd lose their reputations, their standing, and perhaps even their positions entirely. The uprising was in full swing. The only thing left was the finishing blow. The HOA board had endured humiliation, but they were still clinging to power. Even as the website spread and residents revolted, they refused to resign. They hid behind legal jargon, claimed procedural errors, and doubled down on their threats. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. The facade was shattered. All that remained was to finish the job, and the homeowner knew exactly how to do it. The plan was already in motion. For weeks, the homeowner had been quietly preparing a dossier, not just the photos and spreadsheets that had been shared online, but a complete package of evidence. Every fine, every letter, every instance of selective enforcement. Testimonies from neighbors who had been bullied, screenshots of emails filled with threats, and even recordings from meetings where board members mocked the very residents they claimed to represent. It was a mountain of proof, and it was ready to be unleashed. The homeowner reached out to local journalists, pitching the story as a classic tale of power abuse in the suburbs. And to the homeowner's surprise, reporters jumped at it. HOA horror stories were a staple in local news cycles, but rarely was there such detailed, undeniable evidence. This wasn't hearsay. It was documented hypocrisy, laid bare for all to see. Within days, a local news van was parked at the entrance of the neighborhood. Cameras rolled as residents gathered, eager to tell their stories. One by one, neighbors described the fines, the harassment, the endless nitpicking. They spoke about being made to feel like criminals in their own homes, while the board members lived above the very rules they enforced. The footage was damning. Reporters contrasted images of the HOA president's broken fence with violation letters sent to a resident whose fence was only slightly faded. They showed side-by-side comparisons of the treasurer's overflowing trash bins against fines issued to families for leaving theirs out for a single night. The hypocrisy was undeniable, the abuse of power plain as day. When the segment aired, it spread like wildfire. Social media picked it up, comments poured in, and suddenly the story wasn't just a neighborhood scandal. It was a public spectacle. Viewers across the city, even across the country, laughed and raged at the absurdity of an HOA finding someone for a too green lawn while their own yards looked like disaster zones. The HOA board tried to fight back, issuing a statement calling the report misleading and taken out of context. But the damage was done. Their names, their homes, their hypocrisy. It was all public now. And once the internet latched onto the story, there was no undoing it. Memes circulated. Comment. Sections filled with mockery. The board members had become symbols of everything wrong with petty, power-hungry HOAs. Inside the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. Residents who had once kept quiet now shouted for the board's resignation. Petitions turned into formal recall efforts. Neighbors who had been divided for years suddenly found common ground in their shared outrage. The balance of power had shifted completely. The homeowner watched as the board unraveled. The president stopped showing up to meetings altogether. The vice president, once smug and untouchable, was now seen hurriedly repainting shutters in the middle of the night. The treasurer, confronted by angry neighbors at their doorstep, avoided leaving their home altogether. But the board still hadn't resigned. They clung to their positions, insisting they were the victims of a smear campaign. That stubbornness only fueled the rebellion further. Residents didn't just want them gone, they wanted accountability. They wanted justice. So, the homeowner escalated again. Copies of the dossier were sent to the state agency that oversaw homeowner associations, complete with a formal complaint detailing every violation of law and policy. Attorneys in the neighborhood volunteered to help, citing multiple instances of abuse of power and breach of fiduciary duty. What had started as a personal feud over a lawn was now a legal case with the potential to dissolve the board entirely. The board members must have realized the walls were closing in. Their communications grew frantic, filled with desperate attempts to rewrite rules, delete records, and discredit the homeowner leading the charge. But every move was documented. Every attempt at cover-up only added to the pile of evidence. They weren't digging themselves out. They were digging their own graves. The tipping point came at the next community-wide vote. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs with low turnout. But this time, the room was packed. Residents lined the walls, some even standing outside just to be part of it. The agenda was simple: a vote of no confidence in the board. The results weren't even close. Nearly every hand in the room shot up in favor of removing the board. The few dissenters, mostly friends of the board members, were drowned out by overwhelming voices demanding change. The vote passed, and with it, the board's reign ended. The president, red-faced and trembling, stormed out of the room. The treasurer resigned on the spot, muttering about ungrateful neighbors. The vice president tried to argue the process was invalid, but no one listened. They were done. Their authority had evaporated, stripped away not by legal maneuvers, but by the very people they had tried to control. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. The oppressive weight of constant fines, threats, and intimidation was gone. In its place was something far stronger: unity. And yet, even as the board members packed up their files and slunk back to their homes, the homeowner wasn't finished. Because while the resignations were satisfying, the story wasn't complete until accountability was real. The legal complaints were still in motion, and the homeowner had no intention of letting the former board escape without consequences. The final blow had been delivered. The board was defeated. But the story wasn't over. Not yet, because soon the consequences would come knocking. The board was gone, their power stripped away by the very neighbors they had once bullied. But the story didn't end with their resignations. For a community that had lived under their control for so long, the real question was, what came next? In the days following the vote of no confidence, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter. The tension that had once hovered like a storm cloud now lifted. People who had barely spoken to each other before now stopped to chat at mailboxes and sidewalks, bonded by their shared victory. For years, the HOA had turned neighbors against one another, using fear and fines to divide them. But now, that division was gone. Unity had replaced fear. The homeowner, who had once stood alone against the HOA, now found themselves surrounded by allies. Neighbors thanked them quietly, slipping notes of appreciation into their mailbox, waving when they passed by. Some even admitted they had been too scared to speak up before, but seeing someone stand tall had given them courage. The once quiet rebellion had become a triumph for the entire community. But while the board members no longer sat in their positions of authority, their troubles were far from over. The formal complaints filed with the state agency began moving forward. Investigators reviewed the evidence, combing through years of violations and records. It didn't take long for the truth to surface: mismanagement of funds, selective enforcement of rules, and multiple breaches of their legal obligations as board members. The state issued fines, not to the homeowners this time, but to the former board themselves. Their names were publicly listed in reports, their reputations stained beyond repair. Some faced lawsuits from neighbors who had been unfairly targeted. Others quietly sold their homes and moved away, unable to face the community they had once ruled over. The president, once smug and untouchable, was seen packing moving boxes late one night, the glow of a for sale sign flickering in the yard days later. The treasurer's home sat dark and empty for weeks before a new family moved in. The vice president, too stubborn to leave, became the subject of whispers and pointed stares, a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rebuilt itself. A temporary committee of residents stepped in to manage community affairs, but this time, transparency was the rule. Meetings were open, decisions voted on fairly, and communication flowed freely. The focus shifted from control and punishment to improvement and cooperation. Landscaping projects were organized not with threats, but with volunteers. Social gatherings replaced fines as a way to build harmony. The community finally felt like a community again. As for the homeowner, their yard, the lawn that had started it all, remained exactly the same. Lush, green, and perfectly maintained, it stood as a quiet monument to the absurdity of the original fine. Neighbors often joked about it, calling it the lawn that saved the neighborhood. What had once been labeled as too green was now a symbol of resilience. Looking back, it was almost surreal. One ridiculous letter demanding payment for a lawn had sparked a chain of events that tore down an entire system of abuse. It wasn't just about the grass or the fines or even the hypocrisy of the board. It was about standing up when no one else would, about refusing to be bullied into silence, and about showing others that even the smallest spark could start. A fire that changed everything. The homeowner often reflected on how close they had come to simply paying the fine, how easy it would have been to give in and move on. But something about that absurdity had struck a nerve. Something about the injustice had made it impossible to stay quiet. And in choosing to fight back, they had uncovered not just corruption, but a shared frustration simmering across the entire community. The battle had been long, filled with stress, threats, and moments of doubt. But in the end, it was worth it. The neighborhood was free, the bullies defeated, and the community stronger than it had ever been. Of course, there would always be challenges. HOAs, even reformed ones, had rules to follow and responsibilities to uphold. But now, there was trust. Now, there was accountability. No one person, no small group, could ever again hold the neighborhood hostage through fear and fines. And so, life moved on. The news reports faded, the memes died down, and the outside world turned its attention to news stories. But inside the neighborhood, the memory lingered. Every time someone walked past that lush green lawn, they remembered the fight. Every time a meeting ended with laughter instead of arguments, they remembered what had been lost and what had been won. The homeowner had not only defended their yard, they had defended their community. And in doing so, they had turned what was meant to be a punishment into a legacy of defiance. What had started with a fine for grass being too green had ended with the collapse of a corrupt board, the unification of a neighborhood, and the reminder that even the smallest act of resistance can topple giants. The HOA had tried to make an example out of one person. Instead, that one person had made an example out of them, and in the end, the nightmare the HOA tried to create had become their own.